Tight end was a strength for Oregon football in 2022, but is that the case going into spring football and the 2023 season? We'll talk about that and more on this episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. And we're back like we never left. What's going on, Oregon fans? How we living? Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. I'm your host, Max Torres, publisher and lead editor of Ducks Digest, covering the Oregon Ducks over on Fan Nation, part of the Sports Illustrated Network. We are continuing on with our Oregon football spring positional preview series here on the Ducks Dish podcast. Couple of quick reminders before we get into today's episode of the show. Go ahead and drop me a follow on Twitter at mtorresports. I'm also at mtorresports on Instagram. And then a friendly reminder to like, comment, and subscribe wherever you're listening to today's podcast or viewing it. If you're viewing it, you're more than likely doing that on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres is where you can find us. And then if you're listening to the podcast, you can listen to us on your podcasting platform of choice. So, in our last episode, we talked about Oregon's stacked running back room heading into spring football. Make sure to go ahead and give that a listen or review if you haven't already. And now we're going to be talking about the Oregon tight ends as we continue our spring football preview for the Oregon Ducks. And I think it wouldn't be a stretch to say that this group was stacked in 2022, but going into spring football, we've seen a whole lot of change at the tight end position for Oregon, whether that be departures or players that Oregon was recruiting kind of later on in the 2023 cycle, and then kind of where this group is at. So I think that because the group was so strong in 2022, let's talk about how the personnel has changed, because we have seen 3 transfers from this position. A lot of people probably mainly are concerned with 2, but there have been three transfers. So starting off, you have Maliki Matavao, who was an All-American tight end that signed with Oregon in the 2021 class. Both he and Terence Ferguson signed with Oregon in 2021, and they wasted no time finding the field. Maliki Matavao even had that touchdown against Ohio State in that crazy win over the Buckeyes in Columbus. That was probably the coolest sports event that I've ever covered. Probably my top sports memory, definitely for college football, although the 2014 Rose Bowl was pretty cool too. So 2015, excuse me. That was when they made their run at the Natty, but Maliki Matavao was definitely a pretty significant departure for Oregon. I think that, he was probably just someone that wanted to be the guy at tight end in the offense, and that just wasn't realistic for him at Oregon, I guess, if I'm just trying to kind of put myself in his shoes and think about his role and his projection at Oregon, because Terence Ferguson was and is the guy at tight end. So Maliki Matavao, all the best, wish all the best for him, but he decided to enter the transfer portal and has since ended up at UCLA. The Bruins recruited him pretty heavily coming out of high school, out of the Las Vegas area at Liberty High School, where the Ducks got Anthony Jones and Sir Mells in the 2022 class. So those guys are still on the roster. Obviously, Sir Mells might be playing a little bit of offensive line, it looks like, in spring football. So we've got to keep following that storyline and see what develops there. But I think Maliki Matavao was a really solid tight end while he was at Oregon. I think that Terence was the better receiving tight end of the two, and maybe Maliki was the better blocking tight end of the two, just with their difference in play style. I think Terence was much more the pass-catching guy, even got flexed out wide as a receiver kind of a deal in high school, and Maliki was used as more of a traditional tight end, but he still caught the ball a lot in high school. But that's the deal with Maliki. He's going to be going to UCLA with the Bruins headed to the Big Ten in 2024, and Chip Kelly's a really bright offensive mind. You saw how well some tight ends have done there in the past, looking at Greg Dulcich, who's now on the Broncos, I believe. So I think that's a move where he'll be able to carve out a role out there in Westwood. So Maliki Matavao was a kind of a little bit of a surprising move, but also not that surprising since we talked about Terence Ferguson's emergence in 2022. But the other tight end that moved on to another spot is Cam McCormick. Cam McCormick was a veteran tight end at Oregon, and I think he's going to be playing his 7th 7th, maybe 8th college football season. Someone has to double check that for me. Apologies for not knowing how many years it's been, but he's played a whole bunch of college football, and I think a lot of people are surprised he still has eligibility. But as we know, he got really banged up. He was at Oregon during the COVID season, so you're going to have some extra eligibility there. But Cam McCormick's going to be reuniting with Mario Cristobal and Coral Gables at the University of Miami to play for the Hurricanes. So that's another big move going all the way across the country to wrap up his college football. A little bit of a theme, if you want to call it that, for former Ducks following Cristobal. You had Logan Sagapolu along the offensive line. He was definitely a big one that chose to follow him. There's another offensive lineman that I'm completely blanking on that also followed him. So I guess I'm just having some brain farts. I've been recording a lot of podcasts today, so just hang in there with me. But he's not the first Duck to follow Cristobal to Miami, but those are the two big departures. And Cam McCormick, he was pretty good early on in his career at Oregon, and then he got hurt, and then never quite made it back to that same level of productivity. So I think that Maliki is a bigger loss than Cam from a production standpoint. But as you know, it's definitely valuable to have a veteran guy like McCormick in your room just to kind of be your glue guy. That's a tongue twister. Be your glue guy and keep your culture together. But he's going to be playing in the ACC in 2023. The third departure at tight end was Terrell Tillman, a converted edge rusher from the 2021 recruiting class out of the state of Texas. He really didn't play a whole lot of tight end, but when he did move over to tight end, he was getting raved about with his speed. I remember Kenny Dillingham talking about how he was the fastest tight end in that room which you would kind of expect. I think he was around like 6'4-ish, 220, 215. So he was a lot lighter than a lot of those tight ends that are usually in the 6'4", 6'5", and above, 240, 250 range. So Terrell Tillman, he transfers back to his home state of Texas to play for the Texas Tech Running Rebels. I want to say, is it Running Rebels or Red Rebels? Now I need to look because I'm going to sound silly if I don't. Or the Red Raiders. The Red Raiders. That's what it is. My bad. The Texas Tech Red Raiders. So Tillman goes back to Texas to play for the Red Raiders. Those are the three departures. So now some of you guys might be saying, hey, Max, all right, whatever. Let's get back to the guys that are going to be playing for Oregon next year. And that starts with Terence Ferguson. Terence Ferguson is the face of the Oregon tight end room. He's the most productive guy that the Ducks have on their roster in Drew Maringer's room. In 2022, he caught 32 passes for 391 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. So pretty solid production. Just taking a look at where those marks stack up on the team. Terence Ferguson was 4th on the team with 32 catches. And then he was also 4th on the team in receiving yards. And he was 2nd on the team in touchdowns, with Troy Franklin being the only guy who had more at 9. So Terence Ferguson has obviously clearly been very effective for Oregon since he's really taken his game up a level in 2022, and I think there's reason to believe that he can take it even a level further in 2023, seeing that he is comfortable with the college game, and he's obviously had a good chemistry with Bo Nix, with those guys, connecting a number of times in 2022. I think another thing that's interesting with Terence Ferguson is that this guy's consistent. He's registered a catch in 16 straight games ahead of his junior season, and he's actually just 4 catches away from entering the top 10 all-time at Oregon for catches by a tight end. So I think that there's something to be said about the consistency that Oregon has gotten from Terence Ferguson. I think that a lot of times tight ends can sometimes be viewed as, safety valves, safety blanket kind of guys, or sometimes they're 50-50 guys where you just toss it up to them and you let them go get it. Or they're just absolute playmakers. They can do a little bit of everything like Travis Kelce can on the Kansas City Chiefs, defending Super Bowl champions. So I think that Terence Ferguson is definitely poised to take a step forward in his game. I think he's really become a more well-rounded tight end since he's gotten to Oregon. And this is a guy who has really changed his body quite a bit since he got to Oregon. He got to Oregon at around 6'5", 230 pounds. Now he's like 6'5", 255 pounds. So he's really packed a lot of muscle and a lot of weight onto his frame, and he's clearly moving really well. He's elusive. He's not easy to tackle. And I don't think he's lost that athleticism. That was part of what made him such a big recruit for Oregon. You'll remember, guys, if you've been following recruiting for a while, I don't know if it was Rivals or 247 or which recruiting outlet said this, but some people were calling Oregon's 2021 tight end haul the best in the country. And I think that they really were. Maliki Matavao, Terence Ferguson, they were really in that conversation. They kind of called themselves the Twin Towers. I remember seeing these guys at fall camp in 2021 saying, these guys don't look like freshmen. They're just monsters. They're huge. But that's just kind of where the tight end position's at. You look at Darnell Washington at Georgia, and I think that's a good example as well. But Terence Ferguson has been stellar since he got to Oregon, and I think that they can get a little bit more out of him. I like the direction that his game's going. I've talked about how he's changed his body. I think that's really helped him with his inline blocking, which is something Oregon's going to need with how much they like to run. So he's a versatile guy, and he's not one-dimensional, which I think is really good, and I think that brings more value to Oregon's offense in 2023. The next guy we have to talk about on the depth chart at tight end, the second of 3 scholarship tight ends that Oregon has going into the 2023 season, as of right now, going into spring, is Patrick Herbert. Another guy, pride of Eugene, out of Sheldon High School, the younger brother of Justin Herbert, the Los Angeles Chargers quarterback. Patrick Herbert's kind of trying to rewrite his story a little bit. He came to Oregon as a member of the 2019 recruiting class as one of the higher rated tight ends nationally. I want to say he was well within the top 10 at his position. You know how guys from Oregon, the state of Oregon, I should say, kind of tend to fly under the radar. Oregon isn't really a school that gets a lot of respect nationally. Also doesn't tend to produce as much talent for college football as a lot of these other schools, but that's beside the point. Maybe Patrick Herbert's kind of just low key right now, because even though Oregon has a pretty much a shortage at tight end, that means that there's snaps to be had. That means that we're going to be seeing a lot of Patrick Herbert in 2023, and that's something to be excited about. Was he super productive in 2022? Not necessarily. He caught 6 passes for 95 yards and a touchdown. But the big positive to take away from Patrick Herbert's 2022 season is that he was healthy. The guy was available. He played in every game. And I think it very much applies for him and for the tight end position, a position that gets hurt all the time, which makes a lot of sense because they're always getting their knees dived at. People try to take out their knees. So those injuries happen a lot. The best ability is availability in this case for Patrick Herbert. So maybe that was just his bounce back season to just get back into the swing of things with football. I mean, I think people don't understand, and I don't want to say that I understand it because I've never had, a severe injury like he has, or like some of these other guys that I've talked about have, but it's a grind on your mental to be going through these severe injuries. And it takes a tremendous amount of mental toughness, mental fortitude to keep yourself in a positive space and to work back from injuries, and to have, I want to say, the same injury on both knees. That's got to be super, super deflating. So for him to be where he's at, to be healthy right now, and to be in a position where he can carve out a much bigger role at Oregon, I think that's awesome. And that's why I think he's a guy that you should be excited about going into spring practice, because you've seen a lot of him in terms of just being around the program. You've seen a lot of his name because he's linked to Justin. And every time when I was in Eugene and he would get asked about Justin, it was just like, he wasn't mean about it or anything, but you could just tell the guy didn't want to talk about his brother. It's kind of like, I'm Patrick. Like, I want to focus on what I'm doing. I want to focus on this team right now. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Just a guy who's, I'm sure he's super happy for his brother. Obviously, he wants the best for him, but it's like, hey man, I kind of want to stay in my own lane, write my own story. 2023 is the opportunity for Patrick Herbert to do just that. So I'm pretty excited to see where he can take his game as he enters the 2023 season, because he's obviously been at Oregon for a long time, but hasn't accomplished what he hoped to going to Oregon. And 2023 is a perfect opportunity. So why not do that by getting things off to a strong start with a great spring camp during these upcoming months and spring practice. So that's definitely a big opportunity for P. Herbo. moving right along to our next tight end that we're going to be talking about, Oregon tight end signee Kenyon Sadiq, technically an athlete on most major recruiting services, but he's going to be playing tight end at Oregon in Will Stein's offense for Drew Maringer, listed at 6'3", 220 pounds at his time of signing. He's already on campus and enrolled, obviously, or else we wouldn't really be talking about him too much in this, light, seeing that we're previewing who's going to be on campus in 2023 during spring football. 6'3", 220, coming out of the state of Idaho, kind of along the same lines of Oregon, not a state that gets a whole lot of respect, but also isn't necessarily known for producing a lot of college football talent. But I want to say that he was the top player in the state of Idaho. Yeah, top consensus player in Idaho, tabbed as the top rated athlete in the state by 247 Sports, top 15 athlete on ESPN, top 10 athlete, number 4 on the 247 composite. So that's one thing that I've noticed about the way that Oregon and some of these other schools recruit is that Oregon's, willing to try to take a risk or maybe find a diamond in the rough kind of a guy if you're in a smaller state that isn't necessarily known for its football like Idaho. But if you just watch this guy's tape, I think that the upside is pretty evident when you just look at how much of a game changer he was for Skyline Senior High School out there in Idaho Falls. I was writing about him in the signee spotlight series that we're doing at Ducks Digest, and he had something crazy like 3 touchdowns in the first half of one of the playoff games. But you guys should definitely look at his highlights because he's really mobile and super quick and athletic for a tight end. You look at his tape, and I feel like at times when it's not blocking, obviously, you're almost watching like a wide receiver's tape, which is good because you see the clear upside for catching the ball. But then it leaves a little bit of a question mark when it comes to being more physical and being an inline blocker and blocking in the run game. That's obviously something you're going to get better at if you can add more weight to your frame. You're not going to be getting pushed around as easily. And he's going to be going against some monsters on that D line. I've talked extensively just about how excited I am about this Oregon defensive line class, the Oregon defensive line position going into the 2023 season. It's super deep. Might be the best defensive line they've had since Eric Armstead and DeForest Buckner, those guys. And then you have all these big-time guys coming in like Jordan Burch, Mateo Uiagalelei. The list goes on. So I think there's definitely a reason to be excited about Sadiq. And, I talked about how much of a playmaker he is. I like his body control. I think that he has really good straight line speed, which allowed him to get behind a lot of defenses. So maybe you see him involved as a deep threat as a tight end, which isn't something that's been super common for Oregon. But to go back to kind of what I was talking about with Herbert, I think a little bit of it applies to Sadiq. You don't have a lot of numbers at tight end. That's just the reality of the situation. So Kenyon Sadiq is going to need to try to soak things up like a sponge during spring practice because he could be called on maybe more than he was expecting as a true freshman. I think everybody signs with their school wanting to play right away, but not everybody goes into the same situation. Sometimes you go into a super deep room, you go into a room that returns all of its starters, but that's not the case for tight ends. So maybe this is something to be excited about, where Kenyon Sadiq can play a big role as a true freshman in the 2023 season. I think you don't want to get too excited about freshmen. I think you kind of have to temper your expectations until you see them in action and see what they really have. But he's on the roster now and he's going to be there for spring practice. So we obviously have to talk about him. So just from getting to know him as a recruit, getting to know his game a little bit, I think that he could definitely carve out a role at Oregon during his time in college, and maybe that gets started sooner rather than later. Kind of the last point that I want to talk about here on our tight end preview is a point that I kind of alluded to. Oregon is short on numbers. So do you want to go into the 2023 season with only 3 scholarship tight ends? Not really. So I think you probably want to be more in the neighborhood of 4. Which kind of leads me to believe that Oregon's going to go for another tight end in the transfer portal. The transfer portal reopens in May, but guys can still take visits. I reported earlier this week about how Gary Bryant Jr., the USC wide receiver transfer, is going to be visiting Oregon this month. So expect to see a tight end or two from the transfer portal make their way out to Eugene for a visit. I got to take a look to see who's available tight end wise in the portal. It's kind of slim pickings, but it's also not just in general at the portal, because so many guys have already found their spots and made those decisions, but so many guys are still in the transfer portal, and there's guys that aren't going to find homes. So I'm sure Oregon has plenty of people on staff that are going to do their due diligence, that are going to do their homework and try to find those diamonds in the rough, or find people that are maybe a little bit under the radar that could ultimately make an impact. I think that you have two guys that project to be pretty solid pass catchers, with Terence Ferguson, who's obviously already done it, and then Kenyon Sadiq, who looks like he can do it. Patrick Herbert might be more of your traditional tight end, seeing that I think Ferguson is the better athlete, but we also haven't seen that much of Herbert, so maybe his role kind of remains to be seen. But I think you probably want to add a little bit another of more traditional tight end that has some pass catching upside, seeing that Terence Ferguson was the main tight end that was involved, and that seemed to be enough for what the offense wanted to do. But we have to see what kind of a role the tight end plays with Will Stein's offense, seeing that he comes over from UTSA. He's going to be doing his own thing. I talked about it on a previous podcast when I talked about the quarterbacks. I'm sure he's going to want to look at the tight end and see how Kenny Dillingham used them. I mean, he did use the tight ends a pretty decent amount, which I was excited about. I really like the tight end position. Maybe it's because I played it a little bit in high school. I think that they're one of the most versatile guys on offense, with the blocking and the catching, running, playmaking, run after the catch, whatever it is. I just think it's a fun position to watch, and I want more tight end involvement. If Will Stein wants to do that with his offense, then I'm all for it. We saw the 14J formation last year. Maybe that'll be something they keep. I think you're going to need more tight ends for that. If it's something that you want to do in the red zone, near short yardage or near the goal line. So we got to see what the role of the tight end is in Will Stein's offense. Maybe I can add that to my to-do list in the spring here, as we kind of keep doing our homework and keep trying to do some research on Will Stein and find some nuggets about what the Oregon offense is going to look like in 2023. We know a lot of the people that are going to be in that Oregon offense, but we really don't know much about what it's going to look like right now. So that's one of the exciting storylines in the spring. What does Oregon's offense look like under Will Stein? So, yeah, I mean, just to kind of summarize, we went through all the departures in the transfer portal. There were 3 of them for Oregon. One of them from the 2021 recruiting class, and Maliki Monteval, and then a longtime vet, Cam McCormick. And then we talked about what the room looks like right now. I'm not saying that it's hurting for talent, but I think it's not where it wants to be from a depth standpoint. You want to shore up those numbers and give yourself some more options heading into the 2023 season, heading into fall camp. So tight ends are going to be an exciting group, and I think it has a lot of potential, but there's definitely still some work to be done. So that about does it for my tight end preview here on the Ducks Dish podcast. As we wind down, you guys know the rules. Follow me on the socials at Torres Sports on Twitter and Instagram, and then subscribe to the channel and like the video at Oregon Football Max Torres on YouTube. And then share the podcast, share the Ducks Dish podcast, please, with your friends, with your family, with other Duck fans. That is a tremendous help, and I always appreciate the support with my coverage of the Ducks. Until next time, thank you guys so much for tuning in, talking some Duck football, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.